You've probably heard of Plato's allegory of the cave, right? Maybe you saw it referenced in a movie like The Matrix. But what if I told you that the popular version, the one we all kind of know, gets it wrong? Today, we're going to look at what Plato was really talking about, and it's way more interesting and, frankly, a lot more relevant to our lives than you might think. Let's get into it. Yeah, it's a huge question, but it's the one Plato really wants us to wrestle with. Not just as some cool metaphor, but in a very real, social, and psychological way. Are the things we take for granted as reality just shadows dancing on a wall? See, here's the thing. Most people have this picture in their head of the allegory being about some lone hero who breaks free, sees the real world, and becomes enlightened. But that's a big misunderstanding. The original story isn't about one person's escape. It's this deep dive into social conditioning, why learning can be so painful, and how we build entire societies around, basically, predicting illusions. All right, so to really get a grip on this, we've got to start where Plato starts, deep inside the cave. Let's paint the picture. Okay, so imagine a group of people who have been chained up since they were born. Their necks, their legs, they're all clamped down so they can only stare straight ahead at a flat rock wall. Now, behind them, there's a fire. And between the fire and the prisoners, people are walking back and forth, holding up puppets, shapes of animals, trees, whatever. The fire casts the shadows of these puppets onto the wall. For the prisoners, these shadows are everything. That's their entire reality. And here's the first big twist, the thing most people miss. The prisoners aren't just sitting there silently. They're talking to each other. They built a whole culture, a whole society, right there in the dark. They have conversations, they have values, they have status hierarchies. It's all happening right there, together, based on those flickering shadows. So, what are these people actually doing all day? Well, they're not just passively watching TV. No, they've turned it into a full-blown, high-stakes competition. Their whole lives basically boil down to these three contests. First, just identifying the shadow. Is that the shape of a bird or a cup? Second, remembering the order the shadows have appeared in before. And third, the most important contest of all, predicting which shadow is going to show up next. And the prisoners who are the best at this game? Oh, they're the celebrities. They get praise, honors, they're seen as the smartest, wisest people in the cave. And this really gets to the core of the whole illusion. The prisoners think that because they can predict the sequence of the shadows, they must understand the cause of the shadows. But do they? Hang on a second. Is knowing what comes next the same thing as understanding why? Think about it like a gambler at a roulette table who's meticulously tracking every number that's come up, thinking they can predict the next spin. We know that's just not how it works, right? Every spin is a totally new event. The prisoners are doing the exact same thing. They've completely mistaken correlation for causation. Their entire social structure is built on a faulty assumption. All right, so now for the part everyone thinks they know. What happens when one of these prisoners is suddenly set free? The pop culture version paints this glorious moment of revelation. Plato, well, he describes the total opposite. Imagine someone comes and shatters your chains. You're forced to stand up and turn toward the fire. Think about the shock to your body. Your legs, which have never been used, are in agony. Your eyes, which have only ever known darkness, are completely blinded by the brilliant light of the fire. That first taste of freedom isn't enlightenment, it's just pain. So when the person who freed them points to the actual puppets and says, "Look, these are the real things, not those shadows you were watching," what do you think the prisoner does? Do they have this big aha moment and thank their rescuer? Not even close. Plato says the prisoner would be confused, angry. They'd probably argue that the shadows, the things they've known their whole life, the things their entire society values, are actually more real than these painful, bright, confusing objects. They'd want to turn right back around to the comfort of the wall. And that's the key. Truth is often rejected when it's painful and disorienting. And this whole idea of rejecting a truth because it hurts, that brings us to what might be the real point of the whole allegory. It's not just about what reality is. It's about how we learn, how education actually works. See, Plato argues that education isn't what we often think it is. It's not about just cramming information into someone's head, as if you're trying to give sight to blind eyes. He says the ability to see, to learn, is already in there. True education is simply the art of turning that eye in the right direction. It's all about guiding, not telling. Let's make this super simple with a modern example. Imagine a kid puts their feet up on the dinner table. Our first instinct is just to give a command, right? Get your feet off the table. But a Socratic approach is totally different. You don't give an order, you ask a question. You say, hey, what would happen if everybody put their feet on the table while we eat? You guide the child to follow their own logic to its natural, kind of silly conclusion. They realize on their own why it's a bad idea. That little internal conflict, that moment where they see the contradiction themselves, that's what sparks real learning, without any force at all. So the journey isn't over. After the fire, the prisoner is dragged all the way out of the cave and into the real world. And this is where things get a little more philosophical, but stick with me, the logic is actually pretty amazing. It all comes down to a really basic question. What makes a thing a thing? Just do it right now. Take a second and look around the room you're in. You don't have to be in a cave for this part. You see different things, right? Maybe you see, I don't know, a camera and a couch that it's near, and maybe a person sitting on that couch. 3 distinct objects. But here's the big philosophical jump. How do you know that? How does your mind know where the camera-ness stops and the couchness begins? What allows your brain to see them as separate things instead of just one giant, undifferentiated blob of matter and color? Plato's argument is that for you to perceive these separate objects, the boundaries between them have to be just as real as the objects themselves. The principles that define what a couch is or what a camera is, those ideas have to exist as a kind of invisible structure. These are what he called the forms or ideas. And this is the final stage of enlightenment in the allegory. It's not just seeing physical things in the world, it's understanding the underlying principles, the logical structures that make the world intelligible in the first place. You see not just the things, but the very system that gives them their identity. And that brings us right back to where we started, with ourself. This isn't just some dusty old story, it's a mirror. It forces us to ask what prediction games we're playing in our own lives, what social rewards we're chasing, and what truths might be a little too painful for us to turn around and face. So the final question is for you. What are the comfortable shadows you're content to keep watching on the wall?